Hello, this is the handout for early mid-Victorianism. You can see the dates of 1832 to 1890, which are fairly a rough guesstimate. And of course, over such a long period of time, many things are happening. So again, I want to advise that when we talk about the word Victorian, it can be slightly different and mean slightly different things for the writers who appeared during this time period. Nevertheless, there are some distinct differences from the Romantic poets, whom we've already studied, who were influenced greatly by the French and American revolutions, and the late Victorians and modernist writers of the 20th centuries. So here are some of the key concepts of early mid-Victorianism. Keep in mind that England at this time is the most powerful nation on the planet. As such, they felt great national pride. But this is also tempered with doubts. You might recognize this, of course, with our own situation as the United States. In fact, one of the things I find very amusing is how often Victorianism is used as a pejorative, when in fact, today's Americans have many things in common with Victorians. There's a great deal of uneasiness with traditional religion. In fact, one of the things that is probably a theme throughout this whole semester is the declining influence of religion. And over the course of the 19th century, some ideas came out that really, again, in many ways, we're still dealing with even in the 21st century. First is what's called utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a philosophy that basically argues against the notion of hierarchies, that is to say that people are inherently better or worse than other people. Now, the good thing about utilitarianism is the idea that nobody is born necessarily as a noble and therefore is inherently better than somebody who's born as a peasant. The utilitarians believed in education. They believed in equality. They believed that, for instance, men and women should both be equally educated. They also were one of the first organized groups to fight against racism. And, in fact, the utilitarians argued for animal rights as well. The argument is, of course, that people will pursue the greatest good for the greatest number is the slogan for utilitarianism. And while we can obviously poke some holes in that philosophy, it's important to see how it worked against the notion of aristocracy, monarchies, and those kinds of ideas. Another factor is called German higher criticism. This was a way of looking at the Bible, not as scripture, but as literature. And German higher criticism had the effect of kind of opening up, if you will, textual analysis of the Bible and seeing its holes, seeing its stitches. For example, it was a result of German higher criticism that people began to look at the notion that the Bible was written by many different people. Now, traditionally, for example, many people thought that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Couldn't go any further because then he died. German higher criticism and subsequent criticism that followed argued that there are many different authors who contributed, maybe as many as 4, just simply to the book of Genesis. In other words, it started to bring in a serious, rational, even scientific look at the Bible. Speaking of science, Darwin's theory of evolution is probably the best known today of a scientific advancement that went against a literal reading of the Bible. Of course, Darwin's theory is often misquoted or misunderstood, but the reality is that it was a direct broadside against traditional Christian thought. Another factor is that the role of women becomes a bigger focus, as you have a rising middle class. And what this means is that there are more women, let's say, with time on their hands. What do? The society around them limited it very much. But if you had an education and you had the financial well-being, for instance, not to have to tend to your own children all the time, or you simply were childless, what did you do? Well, one thing that women did was they became writers. And one thing we see, of course, in the 19th century is some very prominent women writers. Now, of course, there's always a push me, pull you, right? Some Victorian writers are very conservative. And in fact, their writing and the form in which they write is very conservative. They're not very experimental in the same way that the Romantic poets were, or the poets of the 20th century that came afterwards. Science and industrialization. Well, we could take an entire class just on this, how it affects people and affected the 19th century in Great Britain. But as we see in our own time, in our own culture, our own nation, science and industrialization can both bring great progress, and people maybe are excited about it, and there's also great fear as change happens and old traditions are lost. One of the things that, of course, also happens during the 19th century is you have more and more people who are literate, they can read. Now, the poetry is still considered by many to be the finest way to write and communicate in an expressive way, right? But the reality is, novels, prose pieces of great length, are becoming more and more popular. Jane Austen, obviously, is one that we're reading in this class, but there are many, many novelists who we could not read because we just don't have the time. So some of the greats decided to create what are called verse novels. A novel which is really written in the form of a poem, but it's very, very long. Some people refer to these as epic because of their length, but they're really not epic in form, or even in content for that matter. They're basically the same idea as a novel, except they're written in poetry. Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote Aurora Leigh. Robert Browning and Alfred Lord Tennyson also attempted verse novels. Let's be frank about it, we're not going to read one because this was an attempt, if you will, that did not quite succeed. There was a return to the classical, meaning Greek and Roman, as well as medieval legends that were largely ignored by the Romantics. As you recall, the Romantics are all about the personal, individual experience of the poet. So when you move away from that, as the Victorians did, they moved back to the classical, as well as medieval and Arthurian, especially because, of course, Arthur connects to England. The Victorians were more concerned with large-scale social visions and experiences rather than the personal visions and experiences that the Romantics felt were important. So in other words, there's a movement away from the individual to the larger social group. And along the lines of that, the avoidance of the unique and the quirky in favor of the common and the typical, with the belief that a larger audience connects with more universal experiences, making such a work more meaningful and important. In other words, if you really want to reach the greatest number of people, you have experiences that the greatest number of people will relate to, not some weird quirky thing as might relate to only just a small number of people. Anyway, that was their attitude. Now, of course, as I said before, there are always exceptions. Some writers are more focused in one area than another, but this is a broad grouping for several decades of work.